stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Ling. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am reviewing the player cards from Echoes of the Past, the first Mythos pack in the Path to Carcosa cycle. I'm going to do things a little bit differently for this review due to the nature of the cards in the pack. First, I'm going to take a look at the 5 new player cards, one for each class, followed by the 5 Composure talents, and each class receives one of those. I'm going to wrap up the review with a look at the 4 Desperate skill cards. Those are the neutral cards, one for each skill icon. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, maybe consider subscribing. With that in mind, let's get started. The first card in the pack is Heroic Rescue. It's a 1-cost event for the Guardian class, with willpower and combat skill icons and the spirit and tactic traits. It has the game text Fast. Play when a non-elite enemy would attack another investigator at your location. Engage that enemy and resolve its attack against you instead. Then deal it 1 damage. Heroic Rescue is another take on the free engagement mechanic that we've seen on cards such as Taunt from the Dunwich Legacy Big Box and Let Me Handle This from the Path to Carcosa. All 3 cards are fast, so you don't need to take an action to play them. The key differences between them are the window when you get to engage the enemy and the reward for doing so. Both levels of Taunt enable you to engage any number of enemies at your location during your turn. If you're playing the level 2 version, you get to draw a card for each enemy engaged this way. Let Me Handle This can be only used if you're playing in multiplayer, and it allows you to engage any enemy that appears at any location during the Mythos phase. The card also gives you +2 to each of your skill checks, although that's unlikely to come into play if you're engaging an enemy during the Mythos phase. Heroic Rescue is limited to multiplayer, and it allows you to engage a non-elite enemy during another investigator's turn, say if they suffer an attack of opportunity while they're taking an action, or during the enemy phase. You will suffer the attack, but you get to swing back for a damage. Heroic Rescue's free engagement and the damage are nice perks, although I'm not overly crazy about getting smacked in the face for my trouble. Heroic Rescue's timing is also a little bit more awkward than some of the others, although you can work around it if you carefully plan out your turn with your fellow investigators. And if you're playing multiplayer, you're probably already doing that. Ideally, you want to engage the enemy before your turn begins, so you have a chance to deal with it. Otherwise, you might end up taking 2 attacks instead of 1. And if you can't do that, you're probably better off waiting to play it during the enemy phase. This card does not work on elite enemies, so that is something to keep in mind depending on the scenario that you're playing. There are quite a few investigators who can take Heroic Rescue, including all 3 Guardians, Skids O'Toole and William York, and of course the investigators from the Dunwich Legacy expansion. If you're going to play Heroic Rescue, Zoe Samaras and William York are probably your best bets. Engaging enemies plays into Zoe's strength, since she generates an extra resource every time she engages an enemy. If you've got Zoe's Cross in play, you can spend that resource to do an extra damage, and if you can happen to pawn off that damage from the attack on a guard dog, say, you could do 3 damage to an enemy. 3 damage is enough to kill most enemies in this game, or at least soften them up for the killing blow. York could also play Heroic Rescue. I think Heroic Rescue lends itself to a tankier investigator who can take a lot of punishment. Between the leather coat from the core set and Cherished Keepsake, which we'll look at a little bit later in this review, I think York fits that bill nicely. He's also probably packing enough combat to finish off the enemy as well. Heroic Rescue gives players who enjoy multiplayer another option to engage non-elite enemies. So how does it stack up against the other options? Honestly, I can imagine a situation in which Taunt, Let Me Handle This, and a Heroic Rescue would be useful. Although I don't think any of them are really essential to your success. Personally, if I wanted to include this sort of effect in my deck, I'd probably take Let Me Handle This over Heroic Rescue because it's a little bit more versatile. Besides engaging any enemy that appears at any location, you can use it on many other encounter cards as well. You also start the turn engaged with the enemy, which gives you plenty of options to deal with it. Heroic Rescue doesn't really blow me away. I'm a little disappointed that it doesn't have any application outside of multiplayer, but that's probably just the solo player in me talking. Seekers receive a new event in Anatomical Diagrams. It costs 1 resource and has willpower and combat skill icons, as well as the insight trait. It has the game text Fast. Play during any investigator's turn. Play only if you have 5 or more remaining sanity. Choose a non-elite enemy at your location until the end of the active investigator's turn. That enemy gets -2 fight and -2 evade. This card reminds me a lot of Mind Over Matter from the core set and Exposed Weakness from the Undimensioned and Unseen Mythos pack. All 3 cards allow you to manipulate combat and agility skill tests, but each does it in a slightly different way. Mind Over Matter affects only the investigator who played it until the end of the round, and it provides a positive modifier instead of a negative one. Daisy effectively receives a +3 bonus to her combat and agility while using her intellect instead of her combat and agility, while Rex gets +2 to his combat and +1 to agility, and Min gets +2 for both. Exposed Weakness is a little more difficult to judge. It certainly has the potential to reduce an enemy's fight by more than Anatomical Diagrams, but it does cost an experience point, and it requires a skill test, which is by no means a sure thing, especially at higher levels of difficulty. If you don't want to spend the experience points or muck around with taking extra skill tests, you're probably better off sticking with Anatomical Diagrams. Anatomical Diagrams gives an enemy -2 fight and -2 evade until the end of the turn. You can also play it during another investigator's turn, although it does come with a couple of restrictions to keep it balanced. 1, it only works on non-elite enemies, and 2, you can only play the card if you have 5 or more remaining sanity. Now, I don't think the non-elite clause is all that bad, considering most of the enemies you encounter during a scenario are non-elite. This card won't work on bosses, though, so that's something to keep in mind toward the end of some scenarios, like Blood on the Altar, for example. As for the sanity, it shouldn't be a problem for Daisy, Rex, or Min, although I highly doubt you're going to see Anatomical Diagrams in many Roland decks, given his sanity is already so low. Mind Over Matter and Anatomical Diagrams feel like they're competing for the same skill slot in Seeker decks. If you're playing in solo, you could certainly play both for the extra redundancy. If you've been playing Mind Over Matter in your multiplayer decks, you could certainly swap it for Anatomical Diagrams to give yourself a little bit more flexibility and lend a hand to your fellow investigators. Anatomical Diagrams also stacks, so if you happen to have 2 copies in your hand, you could tag an enemy for -4 fight and -4 evade and really give your fellow investigator a really good shot at taking it down. Again, I'm not really blown away by Anatomical Diagrams. The card is probably better than Expose Weakness, since it doesn't cost you an experience point and you don't need to make a skill test, which is always a bonus. I don't think this card does as much work as Mind Over Matter in a Daisy deck. I think adding, getting that +3 bonus rather than the -2, I think is better to elevate the investigator's skill rather than reducing the opponents, considering that, or reducing the enemies, considering that if you're reducing an enemy's skill value against Daisy, I mean, she's still a 2 versus 2. Say if it started with a 4 combat, whereas if you elevate it, Daisy is now up. But you could certainly swap mind over matter for it if you're playing multiplayer. I don't really like the potential for the scenario to blank this card, depending on how much sanity horror you've taken. But Seekers tend to have a pretty high sanity as it is, so it's not going to happen all that often. Rogues receive a new weapon in KNUCKLEDUSTER. It's a 2-cost asset with a combat skill icon and the item, weapon, melee, and illicit traits. It has the game text Fight. This attack deals +1 damage. The attacked enemy gains Retaliate for this attack. Now, the designers have been playing around with the modifiers and game text on weapons, trying to hit that sweet spot without creating a weapon that's too powerful. KNUCKLEDUSTER is very thematic. I mean, how many self-respecting rogues would leave home without their trusty brass knuckles? However, I think most players will agree that Retaliate is a pretty steep price to pay for that +1 damage bonus. An investigator who wants to use KNUCKLEDUSTER without fear of Retaliate needs to have a fairly high combat skill to compensate for the lack of a combat skill bonus. Unfortunately, some of the investigators who can use KNUCKLEDUSTER come up short in that department. Neither Wendy Adams nor Safina Russo are all that interested in KNUCKLEDUSTER, considering they have combat skills of 1 and 2 respectively. That leaves investigators like Skids O'Toole, Jenny Barnes, and Lola Hayes. You could also certainly play KNUCKLEDUSTER in a Zoe Samaras deck, but really, why would you, given all the other combat options available to her? All 3 of those investigators have a combat skill of 3, which means they will need to commit cards and/or resources to skill tests to improve their odds of hitting the enemy with the KNUCKLEDUSTER. All those cards and resources will add up quickly, though, so you need to make sure that you're generating the cards and resources to support that sort of strategy. And I'm not sure it's worth it in the long run, especially when Skids and Lola can spend a couple of extra resources to pick up the trusty machete. Now, it's important to note here that you can work around the Retaliate if you evade the enemy first. And an exhausted enemy can't retaliate, so you can pummel it to your heart's content with your KNUCKLEDUSTER once you turn that enemy sideways. That's certainly a viable option for an investigator like Skids, who has a 4 agility and is certainly capable of evading enemies. However, I'm not a big fan of basically wasting an action to evade an enemy that I was planning on killing anyway. Evading the enemy doesn't really alleviate the pressure on your cards and resources either. You're still going to need to burn those cards and resources in order to hit the enemy. The bonus of it being exhaust is that it just won't attack you if you miss. Now, I'd be willing to bet good money that Arkham Horror's resident gangster Michael McGlenn will love KNUCKLEDUSTER, assuming he has a combat skill of 4 or even 5 when he makes his LCG debut at some point down the road. Unfortunately, our current crop of investigators doesn't really have the combat skill to use them effectively without committing cards and resources to the skill test, or trying to work around the Retaliate clause by evading the enemy first. KNUCKLEDUSTER, it might make the cut at the beginning of a campaign, but I suspect many players are going to be looking at other options. Once they gain a few experience points, they'll be looking at some of those other rogue weapons that are available, particularly the Chicago typewriter. Mystics get a new ally, David Renfield, esteemed eschatologist. He's a 2-cost asset with an intellect skill icon and the ally and patron traits. While David Renfield has at least 1 doom on him, you get +1 willpower. He has the free trigger Exhaust David Renfield. You may place 1 doom on David Renfield. Gain 1 resource for each doom on David Renfield. He has 2 health, 1 sanity, and takes up the ally slot. Now, I think Renfield is one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting card in the Echoes of the Past Mythos pack. Each class looks like it will receive an ally with the patron trait this cycle, who will either generate resources or provide some sort of resource discount. Renfield is the first one that's been released, although two others have been spoiled in the Unspeakable Oath Mythos pack, which is expected to be released here shortly. There's a lot going on with this card, so I'm going to take a look at it piece by piece. It's easy to draw a comparison between Renfield and the other ally that plays around with Doom, the Arcane Initiate from the core set. The Initiate is a resource cheaper, has a health and 2 sanity, and enters play with 1 Doom on it. Renfield enters play as a blank ally with 2 health and a sanity, and he will remain blank until you add a Doom to him, at which point you'll gain a resource and a willpower bonus. Now, I really like the fact that you control when you add the Doom to Renfield. If you're making a willpower skill test, for example, you could trigger Renfield's ability between step 1 and 2, or 2 and 3 on the chart to gain a resource and the willpower boost, which might be enough to pass the skill test. And if you happen to fail and take a horror, you could always kill off Renfield so the Doom doesn't affect your board state. I should note here that Renfield does give Marie Lambeau an easy way to turn on her special ability. However, Lambeau is only available as a promo card, though, so I'm not going to delve too deep into Renfield's application to her deck here. Suffice to say that if you're playing Marie, you're probably going to take a very close look at Renfield. It occurs to me that I think the other big important difference between the Arcane Initiate and Renfield is that if you can somehow remove the Doom from the Arcane Initiate, her ability will still work. You still get to use her free trigger to search the top 3 cards of your deck for a spell card. Whereas if you remove the Doom from Renfield, he returns to being blank. Fortunately, it's really not that difficult to get that Doom back on him if you need to. But it is a fairly important distinction, considering the Arcane Initiate works without Doom being in play, and Renfield does not. Resource generation is the name of the game with the patrons. So how does Renfield stack up? If you're content to put only 1 Doom on Renfield, you need to trigger him at least 3 times over 3 turns before he will net you a resource. I think that's pretty slow, and it's not all that impressive in terms of resource generation. At least it's a free trigger, so you don't have to spend one of your precious actions to do it. You could also try playing Renfield in an Ashcan Pete deck, in which case you could use Ashcan Pete's special ability to ready Renfield and exhaust him again. But that's kind of corner case, though. I think Ashcan has far better allies to play around with. So suppose you want to be a little bit more aggressive and try to maximize the number of resources that Renfield generates. On the first turn, Renfield will generate 1 resource and add a Doom. So you're still down a resource since you paid 2 resources to bring him into play. On the second turn, Renfield generates 2 resources and netting you 1. There will also be 3 Doom in play at the end of the turn. On the third turn, Renfield generates 3 resources, so you're up 4. But there is also 5 Doom in play. And if you happen to make it to the 4th turn, you'll be up 8 resources and have 7 Doom in play. You're certainly going to want to consider playing a card like Moonlight Ritual from the Where Doom Awaits Mythos pack to reset Renfield's Doom back to 0, so you don't blow through the agenda deck too quickly if you're trying to push your luck with that with his ability. Obviously, the longer you can keep adding Doom to Renfield, the more resources you will generate. It would be easy to determine how many resources you could expect to generate with Renfield if you only had to worry about the Doom you add at the start of the Mythos phase and the Doom you add due to Renfield. Unfortunately, the agenda deck isn't content to sit idly by while you do this. The Doom threshold on agendas can vary wildly from scenario to scenario, which is going to affect how often you can trigger Renfield. Just take a look at the first 4 scenarios in the Dunwich Legacy cycle. Extracurricular activity starts off pretty slow with a Doom threshold of 7, but it really speeds up toward the end as the Doom thresholds drop to 3 and 2 respectively. The House Always Wins puts a lot of pressure on you from the start, while the Miskatonic Museum is much more forgiving. The Essex County Express is a race from the word go, which makes it very tricky to use Renfield. If you happen to be later in the campaign, scenario like where Doom Awaits gives you plenty of time to abuse a card like Renfield, but it seems like where Doom Awaits, with its very liberal Doom thresholds of 10 and 12, is definitely the exception rather than the rule. The fluctuating Doom threshold on agendas is going to make it difficult to rely on Renfield for consistent resource generation. And consistency is really the name of the game when you're building a deck that can survive the rigors of an Arkham Horror campaign. The makeup of the encounter deck is also going to throw a wrench into your plans to use Renfield. While many encounter sets contain cards that add Doom to the current agenda, speeding up the game and screwing up your math, there are 4 worth noting: Ancient Evils, Dark Cult, and Agents of Yogg-Sothoth from the core set, and Evil Portents from the Path to Carcosa. The cards in these encounter sets are capable of adding a lot of Doom to the board very quickly, which could advance the agenda a lot sooner than you expected and blank Renfield, especially if you haven't had a chance to find your Moonlight Ritual yet. So how many scenarios contain one or more of these encounter sets? Well, I looked it up, and of the 16 scenarios available so far, all but 6 contain one or more of these sets. If you're playing Arkham Horror, chances are the encounter deck contains cards that add extra Doom in play, and that's going to make it a little bit more difficult to predict when it's safe to use Renfield without advancing the agenda. As I mentioned earlier, I think Renfield is one of the most interesting cards in the pack. He is certainly capable of generating a lot of resources if you're willing to be patient, or if you just throw caution to the wind and pile on the Doom each turn. However, I'm not convinced that he's capable of consistently generating enough resources to warrant a deck slot during the campaign. And consistency is really what I'm looking for from the cards in my deck. You know, it might turn out that Renfield just has a very high skill cap to use effectively, or he might just turn out to be crap. It's really difficult to say at this time without further testing. But I do think he is worth a closer look, just to see whether he can generate enough resources to warrant that slot. And it's also going to be interesting to compare him to the other patrons as they come out over the course of the Echoes of the Past, the Path to Carcosa cycle. Survivors receive a free asset, Cherished Keepsake. It has a willpower icon and the item and charm traits. It has no game text, 2 sanity, and takes up the accessory slot. Now, this is the counterpart to the leather coat, and it's one of those cards that is just so obviously good that it sort of speaks for itself. Arkham Horror does put a lot of pressure on your sanity pool, so having access to 2 free sanity is simply fantastic. The flavor text on this card is also pretty great. The fact that you can recur Cherished Keepsake with cards like Scavenging Resourceful or William Yorick's Response will make it very difficult for the encounter deck to drive you insane. This might be Wendy's bear, but I think Yorick is probably the investigator who can leverage it the best, since he has several different ways that he can bring it back from the discard pile, really shoring up his sanity and making him very difficult to take down. Cherished Keepsake it's a very strong card, and probably strong enough that I might consider replacing Peter Sylvester with it in my William Yorick deck. If you're playing a survivor or an investigator who can use survivor cards, you're definitely going to be making room for a couple copies of this adorable teddy bear. It's just that good. There are 2 groups of trait-based cards in Echoes of the Past, and the first group are the Composures. There are 5 Composures in all, 1 for each class. There is Combat Training, Scientific Theory, Grounded, Moxie, and Plucky. All of the composures are one-cost assets with the talent and composure traits. Each one has one sanity and the game text fast. Limit one composure in play. Non-direct horror must be assigned to the composure before it can be assigned to your investigator card. Each composure has a free trigger that enables you to spend one resource to get +1 skill value for this test. Generally speaking, I quite like the composures. Between the talents in the core set, the permanent talents that were released in the Blood on the Altar Mythos pack, and the composures, players have plenty of options if they're looking to spend resources to improve their odds of passing a skill test. I really like the fact that these are fast and they're a little bit cheaper than the talents in the core set. So you don't have to take that action to get them on the table. You can just drop these whenever you see fit. Now, the composures can be discarded if you need to assign a non-direct horror to your investigator. So you really need to be playing allies and other assets that have sanity on them. So you can assign horror to those instead of yourself. But that one extra sanity on the composure itself could come in very handy toward the end of a scenario when you're up against it. That said, I'm not too sure how much play the composures are going to see. If you take a look at combat training, for example, it offers bonuses to your combat and or your agility. The extra combat is, of course, always nice in a Guardian, but I'm not really all that crazy about having that agility or the option of the agility. I don't really make a whole lot of agility checks when I play Guardian, and so I think most Guardians will prefer to stick with physical training, which can really help shore up their combat as well as their willpower. A card like Scientific Theory it's competing for a slot against Higher Education, which is one of the most powerful talents in the game. I could see Rex or Min using Scientific Theory in conjunction with a Fire Axe, though, for that combat bonus. Grounded is a little bit different from the other composures in that you can use it during skill tests on a spell card. That includes cards like Alchemical Transmutation, Bind Monster, Blinding Light, Rite of Seeking, Shriveling, and Song of the Dead. It's not as versatile as the other composures, but it could certainly find a home in an Akachi deck who relies on spells to do most of the heavy lifting during a scenario. Moxie it's an interesting card because it offers Skids an alternative to physical training. That said, Skids really needs extra intellect icons, which means some of the rogues may prefer to stick with Streetwise. Although the rogues have received, they did receive a card like Lockpicks in the Path to Carcosa big box, which means they might not need to rely on Streetwise for those extra intellect icons, so they could certainly consider a card like Moxie to boost up their willpower. I think Plucky is probably the best of the composures in the bunch, simply because survivors have plenty of ways to recur it if it happens to get discarded. It also boosts willpower and intellect, which I think are two of the most important skill tests in the game at the moment. You know, the composures are yet another take on the skill boosting talents, and some players really love them, while other players less so. Personally, I like the talents because they can be very helpful toward the end of a scenario, as long as you're not having to pay for a lot of expensive events. The longer a scenario drags on, you tend to pool up some resources, which it's always nice to have an outlet for them, and the composures certainly will allow you to do that. I think the biggest benefit of the composures is they do give players a lot more options to shore up any weaknesses in their deck as the campaign progresses. Finally, we come to the Desperate skill cards. There are 4 of them, 1 for each skill icon, and they are Say Your Prayers, Desperate Search, Reckless Assault, and Run for Your Life. and each of them gives you 4 skill icons of the respective type when you commit them to a skill test. However, you can only commit them to a skill test if you have 3 or fewer remaining sanity, hence the desperate trait. Unfortunately, I think these cards are really quite bad at the moment. I'm really not a fan of these. This sort of win by losing deck archetype might be interesting to explore, but it just doesn't exist yet, and I don't think these cards by themselves do enough to warrant trying to play that kind of deck style. I think the biggest problem with these skills is that they're effectively blank at the start of the game, and they're going to remain blank until you've got 3 or fewer sanity remaining, which depends almost entirely on what the encounter deck throws at you. And I don't know about you, but I really try to avoid being one bad rotting remains pull away from going insane at all costs, and that's why I prefer sticking the horror I take on allies and other assets. I just don't want to take that risk. I don't think, these cards don't really synergize very well with the composures included in this pack. The desperate skills encourage you to take the horror, while the composers encourage you to put the horror on any other card but your investigator, so there's not a whole lot of synergy there. And these cards are also really at odds with the scenarios in the Path to Carcosa, particularly Curtain Call. And a scenario like Curtain Call becomes a much more difficult scenario once there are 3 horror on your investigator, because the skulls, of which there are 3 in the chaos bag, become -3s. And it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to take that horror, basically tanking your odds of success on all of your skill checks, just to be able to improve the odds on the skill test that you happen to have the desperate skill for. So why would you? It makes no sense to me why you would make it that much harder on yourself on all skill tests just to be able to play something like Desperate Search a couple times. That just doesn't add up. And if you're going to be drawing those -3s on all other skill tests, it just isn't worth it. It really isn't worth it. Now, there are some circumstances in which you might consider playing these cards. First, you could play investigators like Roland Banks or Mark Harrigan, who have only 5 sanity to begin with. It's not hard to have only 3 or fewer remaining sanity when you've only got 5 to begin with. The desperate skills are still blank cards at the start of the game, though, and most of them aren't going to help you if you run into sanity trouble. And that's why I think I'd prefer to play an ally like Brother Xavier from the Miskatonic Museum Mythos pack to compensate for that over cards like these. You're certainly going to need to play those types of cards if you want to play around with the desperate skills in investigators like that. You could also toss the desperate skills into your deck if you've suffered some mental trauma over the course of the campaign. Unfortunately, in my experience, mental trauma has a way of snowballing. If you've suffered some mental trauma, you're extremely vulnerable to suffering more. And again, none of these cards, with the possible exception of Say Your Prayers, is going to help you in that situation. And so, sure, you might start the game with 2 mental trauma and your desperate skills will not be blank, but unless you've got something like Say Your Prayers to prevent you from taking more horror, you're probably going to go insane very quickly. These cards might also come in handy if you're playing on hard or expert difficulty. 4 skill icons are certainly helpful when there are more negative modifiers floating around in the chaos bag. But again, I don't think it doesn't really help you in a scenario like Curtain Call. And if you pour on the horror, you're even more vulnerable to rotting remains, and the skulls are -1 for each horror on you in that scenario. And I just don't think that's not a great situation to be in. And I'm not even convinced that the desperate skills are better than the neutral skill cards from the core set, even if you meet the sanity requirement to play them. I would much rather have 2 skill icons and a card draw than 4 skill icons, just because that extra card draw is hard to come by for most classes. You also need to consider whether those 2 extra skill icons are useful, or whether they're simply going to end up being wasted on the skill check. If you're playing on standard difficulty, you typically try to be 2 up before you pull from the chaos bag. And the desperate skills are good if you're 1 or 2 down before the pull, but if you're 1 or 2 up, those skill icons are likely going to get wasted. It doesn't make much sense to play Reckless Assault in a Guardian deck, for example, when any Guardian worth his or her salt should be able should be crushing most combat skill tests before the pull. So yeah, like I mentioned earlier, this whole win by losing deck archetype might be quite interesting to play around with, but I don't think we're anywhere near that yet. And simply tanking your horror or tanking your sanity in order to play a couple of these cards just doesn't seem worth it, especially if you're just starting out on the Path to Carcosa campaign and you're playing Curtain Call. Being able to have a slightly better chance at succeeding at 1 or 2 skill tests really doesn't make up for the fact that you've basically screwed yourself on every other skill test you're going to take in the game. That's going to do it for my review of the player cards in Echoes of the Past. Unfortunately, I'm a little disappointed in this Mythos pack, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that between the Composures and the Desperate Skill cards, that's 9 cards in a pack, and that's a fairly large chunk of cardboard that's being taken up by, in the case of the Composures, we've seen these skill boosting talents before, so they're fine, but they're not all that interesting. They don't really offer us any new mechanics or anything like that. And the Desperate Skill cards, as I mentioned, they're really quite bad at the moment. So, there's four slots that could have been used for much more interesting cards. So yeah, it's the more I look at this pack, it just doesn't excite me. And you look at some of the other cards like Heroic Rescue or Anatomical Diagrams, and they're basically new takes on ideas that we've already seen before in other cards. So slightly different takes, but they're not going to revolutionize how you play the game or offer new deck archetypes to explore. So yeah, so far since from the Dunwich Legacy on, I've been really happy with how the Mythos packs have been. There have been some dud cards, but for the most part they've been quite exciting, and this one's a bit of a step back. But Unspeakable Oath is going to be released here very shortly, and so I'm sure that it will have some very interesting cards to play around with. So I'm looking forward to seeing what it has in store for us, and hopefully I can get that review out a little bit quicker than this one. That's going to do it for me today. If you enjoyed this review, I'd appreciate it if you could leave me a thumbs up. It helps out the channel a great deal. Do you agree or disagree with my review? You can certainly leave a comment down below. I always enjoy chatting with you players about this great game. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified of when I release future content. If you'd like to reach me, I can be reached at manfromlang@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromlang. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.